So if you think about the first time you learned to ride a bike, as a kid, finding a parking lot or a sidewalk to be able to ride on, if that first bike ride, if it feels unsafe, or isn't a positive experience, you may lose that person as a bike rider for a long period of time. And so from an advocacy perspective, if you have safe places to ride and for families to ride together, you're going to create lifetime cyclists.
From Peloton Magazine, this is the Around Podcast, Episode 4. We want to start this episode with a sincere thank you to Igo Bikes in Canada. They have generously sponsored our podcast from Episode 1, giving us the freedom to explore the world of e-bikes, commuting, and infrastructure. Check out their amazing offering of bikes at igoelectric.com. We actually review their Aspire Camillien bike later in this episode, so stay tuned for that. For this week, we are honored to highlight an inspiring conversation with Mike Basaritch, Director of Saris Infrastructure. Most people only know Saris for their bike racks and trainers, but soon they will be known for helping communities create spaces where cyclists feel comfortable.
I'm James Lynch, here with Mike Basaritch, the Director of Saris Infrastructure. You might know Saris from their bike racks and other bike-related products, but they're also working to make cycling safer and more convenient. How you doing, Mike?
Doing great. Thanks for having me, James.
Absolutely. So can you tell me a bit about this infrastructure branch of Saris? I'm not sure people have heard about it, and should be curious to know what exactly you guys are trying to do.
Yeah, it's certainly been an evolution of the product line. It goes all the way back to the beginnings of Saris, where we used the same equipment and materials to make the bike car racks into bicycle parking racks, going back 25, 30 years. And as the bicycle space has evolved, so have we, and so we've developed and manufactured a line of public bike repair stands and pumps. We do bicycle stair ramps, we do bicycle vending machines, we do bike lane delineators, really any product that helps support and encourage people to bicycle more from an infrastructure perspective.
Nice. Was the idea for this branch and focusing some of the manufacturing just cyclists looking around and seeing these blind spots in the infrastructure, like, oh, this staircase is tough for me to get up and down, or, I'm in this busy area and my seat post is sliding up and down. Does creating these products come from a place of solving problems that seem unsolved, or how do you go about picking something to design?
Yeah, it's leveraging. It's what we do on the consumer side with trainers and bike racks. It's leveraging our strengths as a company, which are, one, being innovative in how we solve problems, but two, being a company of cyclists. And so we see these problems on our daily commute to work. And so how do we solve those issues, whether it be a flat tire on the way to work, whether it be the fact that we can't park our bikes at the local coffee shop, whether it's being in a bike lane that feels unsafe or feels like a construction zone. It's inherent in who we are as employees of Saris to A, solve problems, but B, have those problems be in the bicycle infrastructure space.
We're seeing a real boom, especially in this era of coronavirus, of people who maybe stepped away from riding their bikes, stepping back into it, either to get outside or for exercise, or perhaps to avoid crowded areas and as a transportation means. How much easier does having these infrastructure things make it for someone who hasn't been in the biking world to get back into it? I'm especially thinking something like a bike lane that I know you guys work on.
And a lot of leaders in the bike industry have, for years and decades, believed in the bike as a tool and catalyst to solving huge problems, both locally and globally, whether it's climate change or equity in transportation. I mean, there's these huge issues that the bike can solve, and we've been sort of preaching that and announcing that with some success. And it's really it's taken a global pandemic to really put a magnifying glass on it, and not only magnifying glass, but a bullhorn behind it. And so it's great to see the bike sort of reach the status that it deserves as not just two wheels that can help you recreate on a weekend, but it can help you get to work. It can help with climate change. It can help you get to school. I mean, it can do all these things that we knew it could, but now there's just a huge renewed emphasis on it that is fantastic. And so we've got a new set of challenges where we've devoted a lot of effort and time on getting people on bikes. Now it's really about how do we make sure people are safe when they rediscover the magic of the bike.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned was, convincing people the benefits of getting on bikes and doing that. How much of your work is convincing people to get back on bikes or to get into cycling by creating products that make it easier? And how much or any of your job is spreading the good word, like actually doing messaging and branding? How much of the infrastructure work is convincing people, businesses, municipalities that they should invest in their bike infrastructure?
There's this thing I like to call the bicycle infrastructure industrial complex, which is this sort of Venn diagram of the bicycle industry, bicycle advocates, and their programming efforts, and then the municipal city engineers, planners, bike ped coordinators. And there's this sort of area where we all overlap, and that's to your question, is how do we all support each other's efforts with products, with responsible engineering and infrastructure, with programs that get people on bikes but also focus on safety and equity. And so I think that is where right now there seems to be renewed efforts in all of us sort of coming together in that space, so that all our efforts are working together to get the maximum amount of impact. So from our perspective, from Saris's perspective, it's looking at commercial e-bike charging, which is a project we've been working on that should be coming out. We're just finishing the last phase of a pilot and should be available within the next couple weeks. It's our lane delineators, which was a collaborative project with Gensler Architects and the City of Los Angeles Department of Transportation. It's a e-cargo bike that we've partnered with Urban Aero, a Dutch cargo bike company, in designing a municipal specific e-cargo bike to replace fleet vehicles. It's working with Vision Zero, which is a advocacy effort that really focuses on the equity side of things, and making sure that we all have an inherent right to be able to move through our cities and communities without fear of being killed or injured, no matter how we choose to move. And then city municipal planners understanding that it's about more than just miles of painted bike lanes. It's about quality infrastructure that's connected and connects neighborhoods in an equitable way.
I'd love to dive into some of those products you mentioned, and some of these initiatives sound Awesome. But before we do, have you noticed in the past months, or how have these conversations changed in the last few months? Has there been a big change? Is there a lot of momentum? Does that give you hope that these changes can happen? Or is it more business as usual, people just trying to deal with their own problems in their separate areas?
I'm certainly more hopeful. In this space, we've been talking about equity as it relates to bicycling for several years. What has changed, though, is that it's being talked about at the levels of government where change can actually happen.
Oh, wow.
Bike pay coordinators and planners and bike advocates have long spoken about the need to really view bicycle infrastructure through an equitable lens, and do communities that really can utilize infrastructure. Are they getting it? And if they're not, why? What are the structural issues at play that are affecting where infrastructure goes, and not just bike lanes, but sidewalks, car speed, vehicle speeds. And so, as I mentioned, it's been a time. There have been a lot of conferences over the years that have talked about it. But what has changed now is that mayors, city councils, people that can allocate funds and can specifically make the changes that are needed are now talking about it. It's not just a press release, and it's not just a campaign promise. It's actually being talked about and discussed and debated in a way I haven't seen, and it's being talked about at federal levels where there's a lot of funding. So I certainly am much more hopeful today than I was, say, a year ago, that there'll be some actual positive results from this.
One of the projects you mentioned that sounds really interesting to me, especially with the idea of equity in mind, is this wave delineator, which my understanding is it's a portable or temporary pop-up bike lane separator. So it's not just painted, but can actually create some separation between a bike and a pedestrian, or a bike and a road. How does having something like that you can install quickly allow the spread of these bike lanes, this infrastructure, and the benefits to communities that might not have had these, separated bike lanes for the last 10 years?
Yeah, that was the whole sort of genesis and scope of the project, was the city of Los Angeles really wanted to have a delineator for their pop-up neighborhood bike lane projects that made the bike lane feel fun and make it an enjoyable space. Because what they were finding was that they would do these neighborhood pop-up bike lanes in areas where they were hoping to build some community support to put in more permanent infrastructure, and they were using sort of DIY materials, traffic cones, bollards, that just made the bike lane feel like a construction zone. And so their theory was, if we could create this sort of delineator that was fun and would make the bike lane be more inspiring, they could then build more community support for the actual capital permanent infrastructure. And so that was our mission from the beginning, was to design something that had an aesthetic to it, that made the bike lane fun, that was still created a safe space. It was something that could be easily installed, transported, from one neighborhood for one weekend to the next neighborhood the following weekend. And so it was a really fun project to work on. And it's sort of evolved from something that communities can use for pop-up bike lanes to now creating spaces. In Portland, for instance, they're using them to help create these on-street dining areas for restaurants. Mm-hmm. They're being used for pedestrian, socially distancing zones. They're being used at sporting events. And we're going to sort of take it to the next level and make it more of a permanent design. We'll have our current one, which is just for temporary use, but we're now in the process of starting testing on making it an actual permanent delineator that you would see on roadways for permanent bike lane delineation.
This is interesting to me because it almost sounds like you've created a product that is capable of doing a bit of advocacy. Something like a proof of concept that you can move into communities and say like, hey, maybe a bike lane sounds like something for people who aren't like you, coffee shop snobs, things like that. But you can get in there and show people the benefits and what their streets can look like with something like this.
Yeah, and the question you had about underserved neighborhoods, one of the things that bike ped planners talked to us about was that when they went in to do a pop-up bike lane in either minority or low-income neighborhoods, is they would use these DIY materials, and the feedback they would get was, like, of course you would use painted tires and traffic cones in our neighborhood, like, we're not worthy of having really nice things. That's the perception that they have over, decades of neglect from city government. And so by putting in something very, very beautiful that creates an aesthetic and almost a beautification of their neighborhood, even for temporary bike lanes, sends a really, really strong signal that the city is interested in making investments in infrastructure that can have significant positive effects for these neighborhoods and their residents.
Yeah, it really seems, talking to various people in the bike industry, that there is a real feeling in cycling these days about let's make this more accessible for all, and that these are benefits that can affect all people. Are there any other products that you feel to speak to that? I know we have the delineator, but tell me about some of these other projects that you've been working on.
Yeah, and the Wave Delineator was, as I mentioned, a collaborative project with Gensler Architects and Los Angeles Department of Transportation. We've sort of taken that model for other projects. I mentioned our commercial e-bike charging stations that started as a collaborative project with Bosch. That now will be coming out in a few weeks for people who want to put in infrastructure for e-bikes. And that's commercial infrastructure, so it's not just for commuters riding e-bikes. It's for cargo bikes that may be doing last-mile delivery. It's for families that may be using e-bikes to replace the minivan to get their kids to school. And so we're really excited about that project. And then again, I mentioned the e-cargo project with Urban Aero. Europe tends to be a few years ahead of the U.S. in all things bikes and bike infrastructure. And so we saw that there were European cities successfully using e-bikes to perform sort of municipal applications, whether it be garbage pickup or parks and rec or painting fire hydrants. And so we worked with Urban Aero to design a cargo area on their platform that cities can use to replace a fleet vehicle, which has just checked so many boxes for a city, whether it's helping them reach climate and emissions goals, whether it's the cost effectiveness of a bike versus a light duty truck or car, whether it's efficiency. In some cases, it's quicker and easier to use a bike and bike infrastructure than it would be a car to perform some of these tasks. It's the equity component again. Like, this is something I didn't fully realize when I started this project, was there are a lot of city employees that don't have driver's licenses for whatever reason. And so now you open up a bunch of jobs for people that were sort of stuck, riding in the passenger seat, as well as human resource departments who can now advertise for positions without requiring a driver's license. It's just back to sort of my original point. It's like the bicycle is this incredible tool to solve these big problems, and I'm just thrilled that Saris Infrastructure is helping create products that open doors and change trajectories really of people's lives, which is just an awesome byproduct.
We've been seeing in the last few years, certainly a boom in cycling, but e-bikes are becoming so much more prevalent, and it's great to hear the products Saris is working on. What do you think the next 5 years as far as the distribution of bikes looks like? Are we going to see even more e-bikes? Or they become an even more dominant mode of transportation even over the standard bicycle?
It depends on how much support they get from governments, and support can take on many forms. It can take on the form of just building infrastructure. So the more infrastructure and the more connected that infrastructure is, the more bikes you're going to see and the more e-bikes you're going to see. You're going to start to be able to use infrastructure to cover greater distances, similar to what Europe does with their cycle superhighways, which is really extending the network out to the suburbs to allow for bikes to be able to be used to cover greater distances, and certainly e-bikes are going to be part of that. It could take the form of subsidies that several European countries and cities are doing by offering tax incentives to purchase e-bikes, to purchase cargo bikes. So it does depend on more than just consumer habits. It will depend on support from many levels to encourage the purchase and use of e-bikes. And I think some of that will be driven just by market forces. The popularity will drive costs down. And so you'll see that sort of organically happen, but to really supercharge it, it's going to require efforts by governments to embrace the e-bike and everything that it can offer.
I mean, that's interesting. It gets to a point you spoke about earlier in our call here about having bike lanes that are connected and not just painted lines, but getting them throughout cities to every community. It seems like there's really an exponential gain when a city or a municipality supports cycling and cyclists, and even supports the infrastructure to get more people on bikes. And it's got to be pretty fantastic to be a part of a company making that happen.
No question. And I think I'm starting to see it. There was these enclaves around the U.S. where people embraced the bicycle for what it was. There was the Austins and Portlands and Madisons and Minneapolises. I mean, we all knew the top cycling cities list that came out every year. But I think what's really encouraging is when you get to smaller communities that are starting to really embrace it, and they're embracing it for different reasons. The cities, the Portlands and Seattles were embracing it because they saw infrastructure really as an economic boon, like it allowed people to access jobs. Companies were putting in bike parking rooms. It was a way to get employees to their job. But smaller communities are starting to embrace the bike really from health perspectives, where they're dealing with higher cases of diabetes and obesity, and are really seeing infrastructure as a way to solve those problems, which are much more chronic in smaller communities. So again, to my point and your question about being hopeful, I am more hopeful because I do see communities that hadn't really embraced the bike start to do so in much more obvious and impactful ways.
When you see these changes in these communities, are there benefits also for people who, for whatever reason, either choose not to or are incapable of riding a bicycle? Does having these communities where it's easier to get around on bike and more people on bikes make life better for everyone in the community?
Yeah, that was always the issue with efforts to get more people on bikes. It's that first experience. So if you think about the first time you learned to ride a bike, as a kid, finding a parking lot or a sidewalk to be able to ride on. If that first bike ride, if it feels unsafe or isn't a positive experience, you may lose that person as a bike rider for a long period of time. And so from an advocacy perspective, if you have safe places to ride and for families to ride together, you're going to create lifetime cyclists. So you're really investing in future ridership. You're investing in current ridership, obviously short term, but also future ridership by ensuring that those first bike rides and that families that can bike together can do so safely. You're really creating a huge impact down the line.
if you talk to someone and they know, you work for Saris, a cycling company, and they know the kind of work you do, and they say to you, "Oh, no, just not for me. I just don't really like riding a bike, or I don't feel safe." Is there anything you say to them to try to encourage people to get back on bikes, to give it a second try?
Yeah, I would say I would ask them, why their experience wasn't good. Was it the bike? Did they pull out a bike that hadn't been touched in 20 years, and therefore, the seat wasn't the right height, or it didn't shift, or the tires were flat? So was it a equipment issue? And if so, then I'd say it's an easy fix to take it to a local bike shop or a community bike shop. A lot of communities have sort of non-for-profit community bike shops that are happy to get that bike in serviceable condition. Or was it an infrastructure? Was it that you couldn't find a safe place to ride? I think anyone, and I'm willing to bet that anyone that gets on a bike that pedals efficiently and is in a space that they feel safe, when they feel the joy of riding a bike, they will consider the bike. They'll look to the bike to recreate on or run an errand on much more than they would in the past. I honestly believe if you have a good first experience on a bike, the wind, it's a cliche thing to say about the wind in your hair and the feeling of moving on two wheels and the balance, and there is nothing like it. And so I would hope that the negative experience is something that can be solved pretty easily and quickly.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for all your time. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it.
Contributing editor James Lynch reached out to Around associate editor Will Tracy to talk about the time he spent reviewing the Igo Aspire Chameleon.
I'm James Lynch with Around, and today we are talking with Will Tracy, who is the associate editor at Peloton and Around. And Will has been riding the Igo e-bike. Will, what bike have you been riding around on?
Hey, James, thanks for having me. I've been riding the Igo Chameleon, or Igo Aspire Chameleon, rather. So this thing is an entry-level e-road bike. So it has the drop handlebars and the skinnier tires for someone who's looking for a sportier, faster ride. And it's priced at $22.99, so about $2,300. And that's more of an entry-level price for the e-road category, where you're normally looking at closer to $4,000 or $5,000 as the entry level, and then you can go well into the $10,000 range.
I know, having ridden some e-bikes, and a lot of them are built as like e-cargo bikes, and they feel burly, and you're grumbling, and the turn is different, not so sporty. How did this bike feel? Did it still feel like a road bike, or did it feel a little bit more like an e-bike that could do road? What was the ride feel?
I would say this one's definitely more towards a road bike. It's definitely not going to be exactly the same experience as a non-electronic road bike, like a traditional road. But I will say it felt definitely much sportier ride, like something actually, as a roadie myself, I appreciated riding.
Oh, so it's still, having ridden a lot of acoustic road bikes, riding the electric still felt so fun, and like you were like out there really pushing pedals.
Yeah, definitely still pretty fun. So it's definitely oriented towards a more entry-level rider. So it has a more upright position. So it's not quite like you're riding a cruiser, but it's definitely at the same time not like you're hunched over in an aerodynamic position. So it's definitely a nice middle ground there. And then the ride quality, I would say it's definitely a very stable bike. So it's going to kind of want to continue to go in a straight line. It's not going to want to deviate too much from its path. But I think an entry-level rider will like that versus a sportier ride, which might it takes less of an input for it to, say, go around a corner or avoid a pothole.
And so, is it working with pedal assist or as a throttle?
So this is a pedal assist. So it's actually a Class 1 or Class 3 e-bike. So it's a hub-based motor, and it can do Class 1. That's how it comes as a default, which means it can go up to 20 miles per hour. And in the Igo app, you can change it to 28 miles per hour.
Oh, awesome. So you can switch between the classes there. Nice. And did you find that, did it help you if you wanted to go faster than that on the bike? Was it possible? Could you do human input, or was it pretty limited at 20 or 28, no matter what you were doing once you were using the app?
I would say as a class 1 and at 20 miles per hour, I could do a little bit more, but I think for the most part, most people will probably be pretty limited to the 20 mile per hour range. I don't think you're going to go a lot faster than that. And I will say it's definitely it's a better equipped bike as a class 1, as most hub-based motors are. It's really good at accelerating, and it's really good at getting you to that 20 miles per hour. But as a class 3 bike, getting up to 28 miles per hour, it definitely has a little less power than, say, a bottom bracket based motor would have.
Sure.
I enjoyed it more as a class 1 bike.
And Will, who do you think the ideal rider for this is? I know you said it's more entry level, but is there, city, rural, maybe someone who rides a lot with people who are used to riding bikes? Like who's the ideal person to buy this bike?
I think it could be both people who just want to get back into cycling or into cycling in the first place and are interested in going maybe a little bit farther than they might otherwise. So maybe somewhere in the range of 30 to 50 mile rides.
Nice.
Yeah, so definitely can get out there a little bit longer with this bike. I would say someone maybe who used to ride a lot on the road, they might enjoy this bike. They might want something also that's maybe just a little bit sportier, a little bit lighter. So I think it's great for someone who's just looking for a fun ride on the weekend, or maybe to go a little bit farther than they might otherwise.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Make sure to follow Around on Bikes on Instagram and Twitter, and read more features at aroundonbikes.com.